He thought humiliating her in front of a packed dining room would prove who truly belonged in a Michelin kitchen, but Chef Adrienne Laurent had no idea he was about to insult the woman who once taught America what fine dining tasted like. The chandeliers of Maison Laurent glowed like molten gold against the polished marble floors as waiters moved through the crowded restaurant carrying trays of wine glasses and seared scallops worth more than most people spent on dinner in a week. Friday night service had just begun, and every table inside the famous Chicago restaurant was booked solid. Wealthy investors, food critics, local celebrities, and business executives filled the velvet-lined dining room while soft piano music drifted through the air. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Heat rolled off the stoves in heavy waves. Stainless steel counters rattled with plates and pans. The sharp rhythm of knives striking cutting boards echoed beneath Chef Adrienne Laurent's voice as he barked orders with military precision. At 46, Adrienne carried the confidence of a man who had built his reputation on perfection and intimidation. His crisp white chef jacket remained spotless despite the chaos around him, and the younger cooks moved nervously anytime he stepped near their stations. "Table 12 needs the duck refired now," Adrienne snapped, slamming a silver spoon onto the counter hard enough to silence half the kitchen. "Do I have professionals working here tonight or children?" Nobody answered. Nobody ever did. Near the back prep station, Claire Bennett quietly rinsed herbs beneath cold water, her sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. At 38, she looked nothing like the celebrity chefs featured on television cooking competitions. Her blonde hair was tied into a low ponytail, her grey cardigan hidden beneath a plain black apron. She spoke softly, moved carefully, and avoided attention whenever possible. Most employees barely noticed her unless they needed extra prep work finished before service. To them, Claire was simply the temporary kitchen assistant hired 2 weeks earlier after another prep cook quit under Adrienne's management. "Claire," one of the line cooks muttered while rushing past her with a tray of steaks, "can you restock station 3? "Of course," she answered gently. Adrienne overheard her voice and glanced toward the back of the kitchen with visible irritation. "And move faster," he barked. "This isn't a retirement home." A few nervous chuckles spread through the younger staff. Claire simply nodded and continued working without protest. But then something changed. One of the sous chefs suddenly rushed toward Adrienne, pale and sweating beneath the kitchen lights. "Chef," he whispered urgently, "the private investor at table 1 just requested the black truffle lobster soufflé." Adrienne froze mid-motion. The kitchen fell quiet for half a second. Everyone knew the dish. It wasn't even listed on the menu anymore because almost nobody in the restaurant could execute it correctly under pressure. The soufflé had once made Maison Laurent famous before the original creator mysteriously vanished from the culinary world years earlier. Adrienne's jaw tightened. "Who requested it?" "Richard Holloway," the sous chef answered carefully. "He said he flew in from New York specifically to taste it." Adrienne looked around the kitchen. Nobody volunteered. Nobody even breathed too loudly. Then his eyes slowly drifted toward Claire standing silently near the prep sink. And suddenly, a cruel smile appeared on his face. The smile on Adrienne Laurent's face carried the kind of cruelty that only appeared when powerful people believed they had found someone weaker than themselves. Around him, the kitchen staff suddenly became very interested in their cutting boards and sauté pans. Nobody wanted to be caught watching what was about to happen. Adrienne slowly removed the towel from his shoulder and walked toward Claire with deliberate calm, the polished heels of his shoes clicking sharply against the kitchen tile. "Well," he said loudly enough for several cooks to hear, "it seems tonight is your lucky night." Claire looked up from the sink, water dripping quietly from the herbs in her hands. "Chef." Adrienne gestured toward the center station where the expensive ingredients for the soufflé were already being assembled. Fresh Maine lobster. Imported black truffles. Hand-separated eggs resting in silver bowls. "Mr. Holloway wants the signature soufflé," Adrienne announced. "And since my kitchen appears terrified of cooking tonight, perhaps you would like to impress us all." A few nervous laughs spread through the room. Claire's expression remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around the towel in her hand. I am only prep staff, she answered softly. Exactly, Adrian replied with a grin. So if it fails, expectations are already low. More laughter this time. One young line cook immediately looked guilty afterward and lowered his eyes. Adrian folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the stainless steel counter. Come on, Claire, he continued. You spend all night quietly correcting everyone's knife storage and sauce temperatures. Surely someone with opinions can handle a simple soufflé. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Claire glanced toward the ingredients without speaking. Deep inside the dining room beyond the swinging kitchen doors, soft jazz music drifted beneath the low hum of wealthy conversations and clinking wine glasses. The contrast between elegance outside and tension inside the kitchen felt suffocating. Chef, one sous chef whispered cautiously, maybe we should let Daniel handle table 1 instead. Adrian's eyes narrowed instantly. Did I ask for suggestions? Silence. Nobody spoke again. Adrian turned back toward Claire. What is the matter? He asked coldly. Afraid. Claire lowered her gaze briefly. For a moment she looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was. A quiet middle-aged woman trapped in a kitchen far above her abilities. Then she calmly folded the towel beside the sink. If that is what you want, she said gently, I will prepare it. Adrian smirked immediately. Excellent. He stepped backward dramatically and motioned toward the station like a game show host introducing a contestant. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the kitchen staff, our prep assistant is about to save Maison Laurent. Several cooks exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody missed the sarcasm in his voice. Claire walked slowly toward the center station as the overhead lights reflected against the polished steel counters. Steam curled upward from nearby pans while flames flickered beneath rows of sauté burners. Somewhere near the pastry station, a timer beeped repeatedly before someone hurried to silence it. But Claire barely seemed to hear any of it. Her eyes remained fixed on the ingredients in front of her. Black truffles shaved paper thin. Fresh herbs resting on crushed ice. Butter softened perfectly at room temperature. She stood still for several seconds, studying the station with quiet concentration. Adrian watched closely, clearly expecting panic to appear on her face at any moment. Instead, Claire reached for a chef knife resting beside the cutting board. The moment her fingers wrapped around the handle, something subtle changed. One older dishwasher near the back slowly stopped moving. A veteran line cook looked up from his grill station. Even the nervous sous chef frowned slightly as he watched the way Claire balanced the knife effortlessly in her hand. It was not the movement of a beginner. It was muscle memory. The kitchen noise slowly faded into something uneasy as Claire Bennett began working with the quiet precision of someone who had repeated the same motions thousands of times before. The knife moved smoothly beneath her fingers, gliding through shallots with impossible consistency. Thin slices fell neatly onto the cutting board, each one nearly identical in width. Even the older prep cooks noticed it immediately. Professionals always recognize technique before words. Adrian Laurent noticed too, although he refused to let it show on his face. He folded his arms tighter and forced a dismissive smirk. Anyone can chop onions, he muttered loudly. But the confidence in his voice had weakened slightly. Claire continued without responding. Her movements remained calm, economical, almost effortless. She reached for a sauté pan and tested the heat with the back of her hand instead of glancing at the burner dial. Then came the butter. Not rushed. Not careless. Perfect timing. The butter foamed gently without browning as she added shallots and lobster meat in one smooth motion. A rich aroma immediately spread through the kitchen air. One of the younger cooks blinked in surprise. How did she get that temperature so fast? He whispered. I do not know, another answered quietly. But Chef Adrian uses the exact same technique. Claire heard them but gave no reaction. Steam curled upward beneath the golden lights while her attention remained entirely fixed on the pan. The pressure around her seemed to disappear. For the first time all night, her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened slightly. Her hand stopped, looking hesitant. The quiet woman washing herbs in the corner was gone. Something older had surfaced in her place. Near the grill station, a dishwasher named Marcus slowly lowered the stack of plates in his hands. "You seeing this?" he whispered to the pastry assistant beside him. She nodded without taking her eyes off Claire. Adrian suddenly stepped forward. "Careful with the lobster," he snapped. "Overcook it by 10 seconds and the texture is ruined." Claire gently flipped the pieces with a spoon. "It already rested too long before it reached the station," she said softly. "Another 30 seconds and it would dry out completely." The kitchen froze. Adrian stared at her. Nobody corrected Adrian Laurent in his own restaurant. Especially not prep staff. "Excuse me?" Adrian asked coldly. Claire calmly added cream to the pan without looking at him. "The protein tightened before service," she explained quietly. "You can see it near the edges." One sous chef instinctively leaned closer to inspect the lobster. His eyes widened immediately. She was right. Adrian noticed the reaction and his jaw tightened. "Focus on the soufflé," he ordered sharply. Claire nodded once. But the damage had already begun. Doubt was spreading through the kitchen. Not loud doubt. The dangerous kind. Silent doubt. Across the room, 70-year-old line cook Walter Green slowly removed his glasses and stared toward Claire with growing confusion. Walter had spent 40 years working in high-end kitchens from Boston to San Francisco. He had cooked under famous chefs most people only knew from television. And suddenly, the way Claire held the spoon felt disturbingly familiar. The wrist movement. The calm posture. The habit of tasting sauce with the edge of the spoon instead of the center. Walter took one slow step closer. "No," he whispered under his breath. Claire separated the egg whites with flawless speed before folding them gently into the mixture. Not too fast. Not too soft. Every motion balanced with exact control. The younger cooks had stopped pretending to work now. Even the servers passing through the kitchen slowed down to watch. Nobody laughed anymore. The only sounds left were sizzling butter, ticking timers, and the steady scrape of Claire's spoon against the steel mixing bowl. Then Walter suddenly looked at Adrian with visible alarm in his eyes. "Chef," he said carefully, "where did you say you hired this woman from?" Adrian barely glanced at him. "Temporary agency," he answered impatiently. But Walter was no longer listening. Because standing beneath the kitchen lights, with steam rising around her and absolute calm in her eyes, Claire Bennett looked exactly like someone he thought had disappeared from the culinary world forever. Walter Green could feel his heartbeat rising beneath the suffocating kitchen heat as memories he had buried years ago suddenly forced their way back into his mind. 5 years earlier, he had stood inside a luxury culinary conference in Manhattan watching one chef dominate an international tasting event so completely that experienced critics sat speechless after the final course. The chef had been younger then, dressed in a white jacket embroidered with 2 Michelin stars beneath the name Claire Bennett. Food magazines called her the quiet genius of modern American cuisine. Investors fought for reservations at her restaurants. Culinary schools studied her plating techniques like artwork. And then one day, without warning, she vanished from the public eye completely. Walter stared at the woman standing only 15 feet away from him now. The same calm eyes. The same impossibly controlled movements. Even the way she held tension in her shoulders matched perfectly. "No way," he whispered again. Nearby, Marcus glanced toward him nervously. "You know her?" Walter barely answered. "I think the whole culinary world used to." Claire carefully spooned the soufflé mixture into porcelain ramekins while the kitchen remained trapped in strange silence around her. Nobody dared interrupt anymore. Adrian Laurent, however, refused to lose control of his own kitchen. Enough staring, he snapped toward the staff. "Get back to work." The cooks immediately moved again, but the energy had changed. Conversations became whispers. Eyes kept drifting back toward Claire every few seconds. Adrian noticed it all. And it irritated him more than he wanted to admit. "You seem comfortable all of a sudden," he said coldly as he approached Claire's station. Amazing what confidence people find when they finally get attention. Claire did not react to the insult. She simply adjusted the oven temperature slightly before placing the ramekins inside with steady hands. Adrian leaned closer, lowering his voice enough that only she could hear. "Do not embarrass my restaurant tonight." For the first time since the challenge began, Claire finally looked directly at him. Her expression remained calm, but there was something almost sad behind her eyes now. "A restaurant does not lose dignity because of one failed dish," she said quietly. "It loses dignity when people inside it forget how to treat others." Adrian's face hardened instantly. Before he could respond, the swinging kitchen doors burst open and the restaurant manager hurried inside looking anxious. "Chef," she whispered urgently, "Richard Holloway is asking questions." Adrian turned sharply. "What kind of questions?" "About the soufflé." She hesitated. "He says the aroma coming from the kitchen smells exactly like the original version from New York." Adrian's confidence flickered for half a second. Holloway was not just another wealthy customer. He was one of the most respected hospitality investors in the country. A man known for funding luxury restaurants worth millions of dollars. If Holloway was impressed tonight, Maison Laurent could expand nationally within a year. But if he was disappointed, word would spread through the culinary industry by morning. Adrian straightened his jacket immediately. "Tell him the dish will be ready shortly." The manager nodded and disappeared back into the dining room. Claire remained focused on the oven timer as if none of it mattered. Walter continued watching her carefully from across the kitchen, his expression growing more stunned by the minute. Then Claire reached for a small container near the prep station and lightly adjusted the seasoning inside one saucepan. Walter's eyes widened instantly. "My God," he whispered. Marcus frowned beside him. "What?" Walter slowly shook his head. "That finishing technique," he said quietly. "Nobody uses that anymore." The older cook looked toward Adrian, clearly debating whether to speak. But before he could decide, the oven timer rang softly through the kitchen. Claire opened the oven door carefully, and warm steam rolled upward beneath the golden lights. Every employee nearby instinctively paused again. One by one, the soufflés rose perfectly above the ramekin edges with delicate golden tops and not a single crack in sight. The room went completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody inside Maison Laurent moved at all. The golden soufflé sat beneath the kitchen lights like fragile pieces of art, perfectly risen, perfectly balanced, carrying an aroma so rich and precise that even the waitstaff near the service doors stopped breathing for a moment. Adrian Laurent stared at the ramekins with growing disbelief. He had spent years trying to recreate that exact texture after the original recipe disappeared from the culinary world. Hundreds of attempts. Thousands of dollars wasted on test kitchens, consultants, and imported ingredients. Yet the woman he had mocked less than 20 minutes earlier had produced it flawlessly on her first attempt inside his restaurant. "That is not possible," one young line cook whispered under his breath. Walter Green slowly stepped closer to the station, his weathered face pale beneath the overhead lights. "I knew it," he murmured quietly. Claire ignored the growing attention around her and calmly reached for a small spoon. She lightly adjusted the finishing sauce beside the ramekins with delicate movements that looked more like painting than cooking. Tiny shavings of black truffle settled across the top in exact proportions. Nothing excessive. Nothing dramatic. Just balance. Adrian suddenly stepped forward, his pride refusing to surrender in front of his staff. "Plating means nothing if the structure collapses after service," he said sharply. Claire finally looked at him again, her expression unreadable. "Then perhaps we should serve it before it does," she answered softly. Several employees exchanged stunned glances. Nobody spoke to Adrian Laurent like that. Yet somehow Claire's voice carried no disrespect at all. Only certainty. The difference unsettled everyone even more. A server carefully approached the station holding a silver tray, but before she could reach for the ramekins, Walter stopped her. Wait, he said quietly. The older cook slowly walked toward Claire, his eyes fixed on her face now. I have to ask you something. Claire remained still. Walter swallowed hard. 5 years ago, he began carefully, did you own a restaurant in Manhattan called Bennett & Rowe? The kitchen instantly froze again. Even Adrian's expression changed slightly. Claire lowered her eyes for the first time all night. Silence stretched across the room. Then she answered in a voice barely above a whisper. A long time ago. Walter let out a stunned breath and stepped backward. My God, he said. It really is you. Murmurs exploded quietly across the kitchen. One of the younger servers grabbed another employee's arm. Who is she? Marcus asked nervously. Walter looked at them almost incredulously. Claire Bennett, he said. 2 Michelin stars before she turned 35. Food magazines called her the future of American fine dining. Adrian stared at Claire as if seeing her for the first time. That is impossible, he said immediately. Claire Bennett disappeared years ago. Exactly, Walter replied quietly. And now she is standing in your kitchen. The room fell silent again. Adrian's confidence cracked visibly for the first time that evening. Memories suddenly rushed through his mind. Techniques he had admired in culinary school. Recipes he had studied obsessively. Interviews he had watched late at night. While dreaming of becoming famous himself. Claire Bennett had once been one of the chefs he respected most in the industry. And he had just spent an entire evening humiliating her in front of his staff. Before Adrian could speak, the restaurant manager hurried back through the kitchen doors looking frantic. Chef, she whispered urgently, Mr. Holloway says if the soufflé is not served in the next 60 seconds, he is leaving. Nobody moved. Then Claire calmly lifted the silver tray herself. Steam curled upward around her beneath the warm kitchen lights as she turned toward the dining room. Adrian instinctively stepped aside without even realizing he had done it. And for the first time since service began, the entire kitchen watched Claire Bennett not like a prep cook, but like a legend returning to a place she never should have been forced to leave. The dining room of Maison Laurent glowed with quiet luxury as Claire Bennett stepped through the swinging kitchen doors carrying the silver tray herself. Conversation softened almost immediately. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished wine glasses while wealthy guests turned subtly in their seats, drawn by the rich aroma drifting through the room. At the center table near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago sat Richard Holloway, silver-haired and sharply dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than some cars parked outside. Beside him sat 2 hospitality executives and a well-known food critic from New York named Evelyn Carter. Holloway looked irritated at first, clearly prepared to complain about the delay. But the moment Claire approached his table, his expression slowly changed. She carefully placed the soufflé before him with the same quiet composure she had carried all night. Your black truffle lobster soufflé, she said gently. Holloway stared at the dish without speaking. The golden rise was flawless. Steam curled softly upward beneath the candlelight while the delicate scent of butter, lobster, and truffle drifted across the table with almost impossible balance. Evelyn Carter leaned forward immediately, her eyes narrowing with recognition. That presentation, she whispered softly. Claire stepped back politely, prepared to return to the kitchen. But before she could leave, Holloway lifted his spoon and took the first bite. The room around him seemed to disappear completely. His expression froze. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he lowered the spoon and looked back down at the dish as if trying to confirm what he had just tasted. Across the dining room, several nearby guests noticed the silence and began watching nervously. Then Holloway looked up at Claire with visible disbelief. That flavor, he said quietly. That cannot be possible. Evelyn Carter suddenly stood from her seat so quickly that her chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. Every nearby table turned toward her. Claire Bennett, she asked breathlessly. The entire dining room fell silent. Claire paused near the table, saying nothing. Evelyn stared at her in complete shock. I covered your restaurant opening in Manhattan 7 years ago, she said. You disappeared after winning your second Michelin Star. Whispering immediately spread across the restaurant. Guests reached for phones beneath tables. One businessman looked at Claire, then quickly searched her name online. The realization spread table by table like electricity. Back inside the kitchen, Adrien Laurent stood frozen near the service doors, listening to every word. The color had drained from his face completely. One young cook beside him whispered nervously, "Chef, you trained under her recipes in culinary school, right?" Adrien did not answer. Because it was true. Years earlier, before fame and arrogance hardened him, he had admired Claire Bennett more than almost any chef in America. He had copied her plating techniques, studied her interviews, practiced her recipes late into the night while dreaming of earning Michelin recognition himself. And tonight, without even recognizing her, he had mocked her in front of his entire staff like she was disposable. In the dining room, Holloway slowly stood from his chair. "I flew from New York tonight because I heard rumors someone had recreated your soufflé recipe," he said carefully. "I never imagined you would be the one serving it." Claire's expression remained calm, despite every eye in the restaurant fixed on her now. "I was only helping the kitchen," she answered softly. Evelyn Carter shook her head in amazement. "Helping," she repeated. "Do you realize chefs across the country still study your techniques?" A hush fell over the restaurant again. Then, very slowly, Adrien stepped out from the kitchen and into the dining room. The confidence that once defined him had vanished completely. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Smaller somehow. He stopped several feet from Claire while guests watched in complete silence around them. And suddenly, the powerful celebrity chef who had spent years demanding respect from everyone else could not even find the words to speak to the quiet woman he had humiliated only an hour earlier. The silence surrounding Adrien Laurent felt heavier than anything he had experienced in his career. The elegant dining room of Maison Laurent, usually filled with confident laughter and polished conversations, had become unnaturally still. Even the waitstaff moved carefully now, as if afraid a single sound might shatter the moment unfolding in front of them. Adrien stood beneath the chandelier light staring at Claire Bennett while years of pride slowly collapsed behind his eyes. Across the restaurant, guests whispered her name in disbelief. Some remembered magazine covers. Others remembered impossible reservation wait lists in Manhattan. A few older diners simply looked stunned that one of the most respected chefs in modern fine dining had somehow ended up washing herbs in the back of a Chicago kitchen. Richard Holloway finally broke the silence. "Chef Bennett," he said respectfully, "the industry spent years wondering where you disappeared to." Claire glanced toward him calmly. "Sometimes people leave noisy places to remember who they are," she answered softly. The simplicity of the sentence somehow made the room even quieter. Adrien swallowed hard before finally forcing himself to speak. "Why did you not say anything?" His voice sounded smaller now. Gone was the sharp arrogance that had dominated the kitchen only an hour earlier. Claire looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "Because nobody asked who I was," she said gently. "They only decided what I could not be." The words landed harder than any public humiliation ever could. Several employees standing near the kitchen entrance lowered their eyes immediately. Adrien felt heat rise into his face as memories replayed themselves in brutal clarity. The jokes, the sarcasm, the dismissive comments about retirement homes and prep work. Every sentence suddenly sounded uglier now that he understood who had been standing in front of him the entire time. Evelyn Carter slowly sat back down, still visibly stunned. "Do you realize culinary schools still teach your truffle reduction method?" she asked Claire. "Half the chefs in New York tried copying your soufflé after you disappeared." Claire gave a faint smile, though sadness lingered behind it. "Recipes are easy to copy," she said quietly. "Character is harder." Nearby, one of Adrien's younger cooks looked like he wanted to disappear completely. Marcus stood frozen near the service station holding a tray he had forgotten to deliver minutes earlier. Nobody inside the restaurant seemed capable of returning to normal conversation anymore. Holloway took another bite of the soufflé and slowly shook his head in amazement. "This," he said carefully, is the best dish I have tasted in years." Then he looked directly at Adrian. "And you almost let pride ruin your own restaurant tonight." Adrian could not answer. Because it was true. If Claire had walked away when he mocked her, Holloway would have left disappointed, critics would have written about the failure by morning, and Maison Laurent's reputation could have collapsed overnight. The very woman he had treated like she did not belong had quietly saved his restaurant without asking for recognition. The realization cut deeper than any insult. Claire gently removed the black apron from around her waist and folded it neatly in her hands. Several employees instinctively straightened as if watching someone far more important than a celebrity chef. Adrian noticed it too. Respect had entered the room naturally. Quietly. Without demands. Without fear. And for the first time in years, Adrian understood the difference between authority and dignity. "Claire," he said carefully, almost uncertain how to continue, "I owe you an apology." The restaurant remained completely silent as everyone waited for her response. Claire looked around the dining room slowly. Wealthy investors. Critics. Nervous employees. Young cooks who had laughed earlier now unable to meet her eyes. Then she looked back at Adrian. "The kitchen is stressful," she said softly. "I understand that." Adrian blinked in surprise. She was giving him grace he had not earned. Claire stepped closer, her voice still calm enough that the entire restaurant leaned in to hear her next words. "But the true measure of a chef," she said quietly, "is not how they treat famous guests." She paused gently. "It is how they treat the people nobody notices." The room went completely silent once again. The silence inside Maison Laurent no longer felt tense. It felt reflective, almost uncomfortable, like the entire restaurant had been forced to look honestly at itself for the first time in years. Claire Bennett stood calmly beneath the warm chandelier light holding the folded black apron in her hands while dozens of strangers watched her with a kind of respect that could not be purchased or demanded. Richard Holloway slowly placed his spoon down and looked around the dining room before speaking again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I have invested in restaurants across 3 countries. Most chefs spend their entire careers trying to convince people they are important." His eyes shifted toward Claire. "The truly great ones never have to." Several guests nodded quietly. Adrian Laurent lowered his gaze for a moment, the weight of the evening finally settling onto his shoulders completely. For years he had ruled his kitchen through fear, pressure, and intimidation because he believed excellence required dominance. Yet the woman standing in front of him had commanded the respect of an entire restaurant without raising her voice even once. Evelyn Carter reached into her purse and pulled out an old folded magazine clipping. "I actually kept this," she admitted with a small laugh of disbelief. She carefully unfolded the page and revealed a photograph of Claire years earlier standing inside her Manhattan restaurant beside 2 Michelin stars. Younger. More confident perhaps. But unmistakably the same woman. Several nearby guests leaned closer to look. The headline read, "The Quiet Genius Redefining American Cuisine." Adrian stared at the article in complete disbelief. "I remember this interview," he said softly, almost to himself. Claire looked slightly embarrassed by the attention now surrounding her. "That was a long time ago," she answered gently. "Not long enough for people to forget," Evelyn replied immediately. One young culinary student seated near the back of the dining room suddenly stood up nervously. "Chef Bennett," he asked carefully, "why did you leave?" The question lingered in the air. Even the waiters paused again. Claire remained quiet for several seconds before finally answering. "Because somewhere along the way," she said softly, "the industry stopped being about food." Her eyes drifted briefly toward the kitchen doors behind Adrian. It became about ego. Fame. Power. People forgot that cooking was supposed to make others feel cared for. Nobody interrupted her. "I spent years surrounded by talented chefs who treated everyone around them terribly because they believed success excused cruelty," she continued calmly. "One day I realized I was becoming someone I did not recognize anymore." Adrian looked down immediately. The word struck painfully close to home. Holloway slowly nodded. So you disappeared. Claire gave a faint smile. I opened a small community kitchen in Vermont instead, she answered. No critics. No cameras. Just families who needed meals. Several people in the restaurant looked stunned all over again. A 2 Michelin Star chef had walked away from celebrity life to quietly feed struggling families in a small town nobody in fine dining cared about. The contrast humbled the room in a way no speech ever could. Marcus, still standing near the service station, whispered under his breath, "That is unbelievable." Adrian finally stepped forward again, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Claire, he said carefully, I spent years admiring your work. Claire looked at him calmly but said nothing. Adrian swallowed hard. And tonight I treated you like you did not belong in my kitchen. The honesty in his voice surprised everyone. Especially his own staff. Adrian glanced around the dining room, no longer trying to protect his image. I thought leadership meant proving I was the best person in the room, he admitted. But tonight, he paused, struggling slightly with the words. Tonight you reminded me what greatness actually looks like. The room remained completely silent as Claire studied him quietly. Then, very gently, she handed the folded black apron back to him. Then make sure your staff remembers it too, she said softly. Adrian accepted the apron with both hands, almost like someone receiving something far more valuable than fabric. And in that moment, beneath the warm lights of the restaurant he once controlled through fear, Chef Adrian Laurent finally understood that respect earned through humility lasts far longer than respect demanded through power. Long after the dinner service should have returned to normal, nobody inside Maison Laurent seemed ready to move on from what they had witnessed. Conversations remained quieter than usual beneath the chandeliers. Guests spoke in lowered voices while servers carried plates with unusual care, as though the atmosphere inside the restaurant itself had changed. Claire Bennett stood near the entrance preparing to leave, her simple grey cardigan folded neatly over one arm now that the black apron was gone. Without the kitchen uniform, she looked even less like the celebrity chef whose name had once dominated culinary magazines across the country. And yet somehow, everyone in the room now saw her more clearly than before. Richard Holloway approached first, extending a business card carefully between 2 fingers. If you ever decide to return to fine dining, he said respectfully, I would fund any restaurant you wanted to build. Claire glanced at the card but did not take it immediately. That is generous, she answered softly. Holloway smiled faintly. No, he replied. It would be smart. Nearby guests quietly laughed for the first time. All evening, though the laughter carried admiration now instead of arrogance. Evelyn Carter stepped closer next. People are going to hear about tonight by morning, she warned gently. The industry has been waiting years for signs of you. Claire's expression remained calm. People love legends more than real people, she said quietly. Legends do not disappoint them. Evelyn studied her carefully before nodding with understanding. Maybe, she admitted. But real people inspire them more. Across the dining room, Adrian Laurent remained standing near the kitchen entrance watching the exchange silently. The folded black apron still rested in his hands. His staff kept glancing toward him uncertainly, waiting to see whether the old Adrian would return once the moment passed. But something inside him had shifted too deeply now. Slowly, Adrian walked toward the center of the dining room and looked at every employee gathered nearby. Tomorrow morning, he said calmly, everyone in the kitchen arrives 1 hour early. A few nervous expressions appeared immediately. Then Adrian continued. Not for punishment. For change. The room stayed quiet. Adrian looked toward Marcus first. Dishwashers eat with the kitchen staff from now on. Marcus blinked in surprise. Adrian turned toward the younger line cooks next. Nobody gets mocked for asking questions again. Several cooks exchanged stunned glances. Then Adrian looked at Walter Green. And every new employee trains at every station in this restaurant. No exceptions. Walter slowly smiled for the first time all night. Claire watched silently from near the entrance while Adrien spoke with a humility nobody inside Maison Laurent had ever seen from him before. It was imperfect. Uncomfortable even. But genuine. And genuine change always begins quietly. Adrien finally turned back toward Claire. I know I do not deserve another chance to ask this, he said carefully, but would you ever consider consulting here sometimes? A faint smile touched Claire's face. Not prideful. Not triumphant. Just warm. Maybe, she answered softly. If the kitchen learns to care about people as much as plates. Adrien nodded immediately. It will. For a brief moment, the two chefs simply looked at one another beneath the warm chandelier light. One had spent years chasing recognition until arrogance consumed him. The other had walked away from fame entirely and somehow become even greater because of it. Outside, snow had begun falling softly across the Chicago streets, covering the city in quiet white beneath the midnight glow of traffic lights and storefront windows. Claire gently opened the restaurant door and stepped out into the cold night air without looking back for applause or attention. But inside Maison Laurent, nobody moved for several seconds after she left. The room remained still, reflective, almost reverent. Because that night, every person inside the restaurant learned the same unforgettable lesson. Talent may impress people for a moment. Power may intimidate them for a while. But true greatness reveals itself in how someone treats the people the world forgets to notice. And that night, beneath the golden lights of a luxury restaurant, dignity quietly became the most important thing on the menu.